again welcome you. This is a second in a series as we talk about sustainable and vital congregations. Last Thursday, we talked about finances and budgets, and two of the big components when we look at our budgets and finances as congregations and ministries are staffing, leadership, which we will cover next Thursday. But the other significant piece is our buildings, our property. And so that's what we want to talk about this evening. And again, there'll be an opportunity for you to share. We're hoping to have the opportunity to share resources, ideas, and so forth. Well, let's get started. So again, this is part 2 of our series, Sustainable and Vital Congregations, as we continue to discern and plan for the future. And looking at those components and pieces of how we do ministry, what we've in our budgets, as I said, 2 big areas for our resources are our leadership, staff, and buildings. So tonight we're going to talk about buildings. So when we think of the word church, if you would go out on the street and you would ask, so what is a church, right? Just that word church, what image pretty quickly comes to mind? It shouldn't surprise us is that when most people think about the word church, they think about a building, because in the Oxford English Dictionary, guess what, my friends? That is the definition for church, a building for public worship. So don't beat yourselves up. Don't beat up members of your congregation when you say, that's not what I mean by church. This is what we've been conditioned to think about. Church as a building, okay? Now, I'm aging myself here, and maybe some of you are part of my generation. If any of you remember, he was a contemporary songwriter back in the, I think, late 80s, early 90s. Jay Beach, anybody remember him? He wrote this wonderful song called We Are the Church. I would sing it for you, but you probably don't want to hear that tonight. But I did want to capture the words of that song, because it goes, I've often found it going round and round in my head. And of course, the chorus, we are the church, the body of our Lord. We are all God's children, and we have been restored. It's wonderful. And again, if you want to go to YouTube, get the tune, it's great. But listen to the verses, the words of the verses. The church is not a building where people go to pray. It's not made out of sticks and stone. It's not made out of clay. Second verse, you can go to worship, but you cannot go to church. You can't find a building that's alive no matter how you search. And then lastly, the church, it is a people living out their lives, called, enlightened, sanctified for the work of Jesus Christ. Okay? Well, that song, the words of that song actually reflect our theology of what it means to be the church. Because then, if you look in the constitution of our church, this is in the constitution of church-wide, of Senate, and of your congregations. All of you, we have our constitution's a model constitution for congregations in the ELCA. This is a definition of church. And notice what's missing in or you may think is missing in the definition. The church is a people created by God in Christ, empowered by the Holy Spirit, called and sent to bear witness to God's creative, redeeming, and sanctifying activity in the world. So when people ask us as Lutherans, well, what is the church? We go back to that song by Jay Beach. The church is a people created by God, empowered by the Spirit, called and sent, right, to bear God's redeeming activity in the world. Do you notice in that definition of church, there is nothing about a building? Okay, have you ever wondered about that? There is nothing about a building in our definition of the church. Having said that, I don't in any way mean to diminish that our buildings are important. Okay, now I may sound like I'm contradicting myself, but bear with me. Our buildings are important. Think about the emotional, the attachment you have to your building. Think about when you think about church, how often that building comes. And what came to me was the image. Remember what happened? Okay, in Notre Dame, when the cathedral, when the building burned, right? If the building wasn't important, they all would have said, oh my goodness, this is so sad, and be done with it. And I didn't, some of you may know this, how many millions of dollars it cost to rebuild the Notre Dame Cathedral. Buildings are not insignificant. They have symbols and carry traditions, and they mean something when people come to them. So while the definition of church is not the building is still important. And what makes it important are these questions. How do our buildings help us fulfill our purpose as the church? If you go back to the definition of the church, the people of God, created through the Spirit, empowered to be sent out into the world, how do our buildings help us do that? Okay. And the other side of that question is, how do our buildings hinder us from fulfilling our purpose? For, taking resources. And again, when we get together and think about ministry and mission, is building a top priority just in and of itself? Or do we talk about what is our mission and ministry, and how do our building, right, carry us? So when we think about our buildings, I'm not saying they're not important, they are. Additional questions for us to ask as we think about our buildings. Again, who or what have we built, invested, and maintained these buildings for? Because think about your buildings, and we have some beautiful, beautiful buildings throughout the Synod. Reverend Wetter and I have the distinct pleasure of being able to travel across the Synod, and we can attest there are some absolutely beautiful worship spaces. We love being in your buildings. But the question is, who have we built these for? Why are we maintaining these buildings? And I'm going to be direct. I don't mean to offend anybody here, but I'm just going to say what I've heard. We can't close the church, and by the church, they mean the building, because I want a place to have my funeral. And again, I'm not dismissing that there's a lot of emotional attachment and so forth, but who is a building for? Is it an insider thing, or is it a building for the community? How do our buildings invite people to gather for worship? Again, if you think about the purpose of the church, right? The people of God, gathering, go back to the classic Lutheran confessions, understanding of church. It's a gathering of people. The gospel is proclaimed, the sacraments are administered, right? And I felt Luther needed to have a little more there. Not that I would ever criticize Martin Luther, but in order for us to be the people of God in the world, okay? So those buildings is a place for us to gather. But even as we think about these buildings that we gather in, how hospitable and accessible are our spaces? Because the other side of the story that Reverend Wetter and I can share with you as we go to different congregations and buildings, what door do we use? How do you find the bathroom? You know, the steps, up, down, da, da, da. Some of you have like half a dozen entrances, you know, and it's not always easy. And I'm a lifelong churchgoer, and navigating these buildings, how accessible is it when we think about these buildings? Again, basically, how do we practice hospitality with our buildings, right? We're about hospitality. Isn't that a core Christian value, right? Welcoming all God's people. How do our buildings practice hospitality? And again, I can share stories. When I served at a congregation in Loveland, Colorado, our building was used. We did not have a homeless overnight shelter. And so different congregations would take a week at a time, and our buildings would provide overnight shelter for families. And at one council meeting, and very legitimate, because trying to pay the bills or whatever, they're like, well, when those people come in, look at what they do. You know, there's a mark on the wall, or there's, you know, this, or there's that, right? So how do our buildings, and those are legitimate questions because we're trying to maintain them, but how do we practice hospitality with our buildings? How do our buildings serve the community? Are they there just for us to look nice so that we can come do worship on Sunday? Do they sit empty the rest of the week? One of our buildings in the Senate, I love this story. One of our small congregations in Northwest Kansas, smaller congregation, a larger building, they converted part of their building. They did get a grant that they have. Basically, it's like, because there are no hotels in the area at all, they have like hotel rooms so that families can come and have a place to gather. And then they provided office space for county social workers. I mean, so the building was being used throughout the week. But what about our buildings? And again, to remind us, as we talk about our buildings, as you talk about your buildings, a reminder, because people still do not understand, you know, they still question this. The title to the property, including, which obviously includes your building, resides in the congregation. Other denominations, for example, the Episcopal denomination, the diocese, the larger church, owns the property. In the ELCA, congregations own their own property. Okay, it is not the Synod. So therefore, while we can ask the questions, we can provide resources, we can assist you in conversations, the decision about your buildings and property is yours as a congregation. And I say that for you to take that seriously. There is still that misconception that the Synod is going to come in, close congregations, and take your buildings. There is, full disclosure, a provision in the Constitution which allows us, well, actually gives us the responsibility only when there is no longer a functioning congregation to preserve the property. I mean, it's actually called Synod preservation. And again, while the property is not the church, we recognize how the property, the building, the assets can enhance ministry. So we don't just ignore, you know, something falling apart. So those are some things to think about.
I'd like you to now introduce Rob Boyer. Rob is the founder of an organization here in the Kansas City area called Narthex Properties. I'll let Rob kind of tell his story, but it is a ministry and an organization that literally is in existence to help congregations stay being congregations, but not have to handle the issue of buildings. So they can either buy buildings, manage buildings, whatever, but we'll let you share his story. But I've known Rob for not quite 10, I guess 8 or 9 years, Rob, I think.
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. Got to know him as he began this ministry and this business. His organization actually bought our sanctuary and education center. And literally that congregation, by the way, is still a congregation. They share facilities with another congregation now and are thriving. So I think there, again, all congregations have challenges, but they're just different ways of being the church, right? What they realized is they didn't have to have the building to do the church, to be the church. And what they also realized was the things that were really important in the ministry, when we put everything aside, what they realized, the congregation realized, was the ministry what made us who we were. It wasn't that church building. So that was life changing for an organization. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Rob. Rob's going to talk to you about facilities and different opportunities that are available to y'all and things to think about with your facilities. So Rob, I turn it over to you, and you're free to share the screen and however you want.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I apologize. I'm losing my voice. I'm not sick. I guess I've been talking too much today. And so I'm starting to lose my voice. So I apologize for that. But I want to start by thanking all of you for what you do. Being a pastor is hard. I have developed an enormous respect for the challenges of all the different hats that you have to wear. Narthex specializes in church real estate, so we're trying to help you with one hat, but there are lots of hats you wear, and so thanks for your service. And I'm looking forward to learning from you today about what you're dealing with. Yeah, my wife and I started Narthex almost 8 years ago. I had a background in business. I ran a company in Kansas City for a long time called Shred It, paper shredding and recycling company. And I sold that business 2014. And pastor friend of mine, a Nazarene pastor from Olathe, he called me and said, Rob, would you come out and consult for us? We don't understand why we're not growing, and we're trying to understand it. So I grabbed my wife. She has a background in branding and marketing. She's a marketing person. And I took my operational expertise and we went out to their church and we ended up doing surveys of the congregation and retreats and looking at the branding and marketing and worship experience and the financials. And we ended up doing conflict resolution, and there were a lot of troubles. And but through all of that, we got really fascinated about the real estate. And the more we started digging into it with other churches, we just discovered it's a huge problem. The real estate eats up 60% of most churches' finances. The buildings usually sit empty about 80% of the time. And so we formed Narthex to be a resource to local churches. We are denominationally neutral. We don't wear a hat in that discussion. We work with the Catholics, the Charismatics. I've done work with Lutherans, Methodists, Baptists, every group that you can think of, and they all have similar real estate issues and challenges that we help them navigate and work through. And so what is Narthex in a nutshell? You know, we are buyers and sellers and leasers and renovators of church property. We have developed an expertise in how to manage church buildings. We don't do commercial real estate. I'm not interested in commercial real estate that's turned into a church. That's not my expertise. I'm passionate about sacred spaces. But we also discovered along the way that churches need access to capital, whether that's a church that might be declining in some way and maybe needs to move to a different building. They need access to capital. A church that's growing like crazy and needs to get into some bigger facility, they need access to capital, and it's a challenge. So Narthex is trying to be that intersection. We have a loan guarantee program where we're helping churches get bank debt, which is an interesting challenge, but we actually go in with the church and help them negotiate better rates on their debt. And there is so much church planting activity. It is unbelievable to me. You're not going to believe, but in Kansas City alone, just Kansas City market, as of today, I have 92 church groups looking for worship space. About 90% of them are churches. Then there's also daycares and Christian schools that need classroom space. So there's just an explosion of activity happening on the church planting front. And so Narthex is trying to help with that. I've got a really short video, 2.5 minutes here.
Wouldn't it be amazing if when the roof leaks,
Recognize
or
this
the
church,
parking lot
Dave?
needs work, or your
Do.
HVAC system isn't functioning correctly, that you didn't have to be responsible for fixing it? What if instead of raising money to upkeep and repair on your building, what if you could spend those dollars to feed the homeless in your community? What if you could send all your kids on a missions trip? What if the church was being the church instead of always having to worry about taking care of the real estate? Wouldn't that be amazing? Narthex is about solving one big problem for the church. What we're doing at Narthex is turning the building from a burden into a blessing for your ministry. We are a real estate partner for the local church.
We were a portable church for a while, so we don't have to worry about tear down, set up. We're able to save a lot financially by leasing a property. We're able to use dollars and cents to meet real needs in the community. Narthex handles a lot of the stress and things that I would be thinking about. So now I'm able to think more about my people, ministering to people, loving people. What do we want to do in this community?
We had a huge rain and a huge storm that came through, and it almost washed out all of our electrical equipment. Just think of the pressure that comes off of a pastor when he realizes that's one less thing he has to do, and he can worry about the people. To not have that worry of the building, all that is beyond the word blessing.
I think that Narthex is a phenomenal resource for you, and they can help you. They can help you in massive ways to take that burden off your back to do what you were called to do. Because what you're called to do is to pastor the church.
At Narthex, we're passionate about sacred spaces, the history, the stories, the baptisms, the weddings, the funerals. We want to honor that by continuing to breathe life into those spaces. We buy church property, we renovate church property, we lease church property, and we help churches manage their real estate.
I've been telling all my pastor friends about Narthex when they're talking about when buildings come up. I'm like, have you heard of Narthex? This is an amazing kingdom ministry.
Narthex makes it possible for people to do.
I think that Narthex is a wonderful resource. I give them my highest recommendation. I know they've helped a lot of churches, and I believe that they could really help you as well.
Wherever you are in your relationship to your church real estate, whether it's becoming a burden to your ministry, whether you require renovation work, or if you're a church planter looking for a home to call your own, let's have a conversation. We're here to be your partner.
So this evening, Pastor Dave asked me to talk about real estate in a number of broad ways. I'm going to talk to you about 3 different things over about the next 20 minutes. I'm just going to share some current trends that are happening in church real estate across the entire denominational spectrum. I'm going to talk a little bit about producing revenue, thinking of your church as an asset and not a burden, and how you might use it for generating revenue opportunities. And then I'm going to leave you with 7 smart ways to become a property ninja, 7 simple things you can do that might save you a small fortune. So just some tips we've learned by doing this the hard way over the last 8 years. Sound good? If you have a question, don't hesitate to interrupt me. Happy to take any questions you have. So there's something happening at the strategic level called the redemptive real estate movement. I don't know if you've heard a lot about it or hear of it. It's a big deal in business circles. Groups like Faith Driven Investor down in Dallas are big in it. There's actually an organization called the Redemptive Real Estate Organization. And it's this movement toward the bonding of kingdom with real estate. So it's not, it's real estate for kingdom purpose. So it's the idea that an apartment complex, for example, should have a pastor that lives in there to minister to the people in that apartment complex. It's the idea that if I'm going to open a coffee shop, that coffee shop ought to exist to serve the kingdom and not just to make profit. There are commercial real estate redemptive projects where large portions of the money they make get funneled back into ministry activities. So the redemptive real estate movement is big. And of course, Narthex is on the front of that because we are the only organization I know of in the country that is actually out actively buying church property for the benefit of the kingdom. And with churches specifically, so the old way that we thought about church, like when I was a kid, that you had a capital campaign and you went out and raised some money and you took on some debt and you built a building. And if you were doing it in the 1990s, you built it twice as big as it needed to be because you were certain you were growing at a rapid rate. So you built a big property. And the idea was, like all Americans, we're taught from an early age to think, eventually it'll be paid for. And then once it's paid for, it'll just be there for us to use forever. And so we kind of applied that mindset to churches. And the reality is that, the building rarely gets paid off because churches are really difficult assets to maintain. They're really expensive. You start putting roofs on churches and HVAC systems. And at Narthex, we talk about the big five: the roof, the parking lot, the HVAC system, the structure, and the elevator, if there is one. And all those things need a lot of care and maintenance and takes a lot of expense to maintain. And so, you kind of end up in this circle with a church sometimes where you just have to keep pouring money into it to keep up with all the maintenance. And so churches nowadays that are thinking into the future, they're less interested in that model, and they're thinking more of, if we own our building, let's sell the building, because then we're going to have cash that we can spend on ministry and kingdom activities. Or if we don't have a building, let's not try to buy a building, let's just lease space. And then if we do have property, let's maximize it for revenue generating opportunities. It used to be, if we had a church building, well, we want the Boy Scouts to come use it. We want maybe a Alcoholics Anonymous group to come use it. We want it to be a community center, but that is not revenue generating. So now the idea is more, how can I share my space with others that are actually going to pay rent and contribute to the maintenance of the building and help fund my ministry? So it's a change in the mindset. So the whole point of Narthex is that we think of churches as defensive assets. So it's constantly using your resources to repair and upkeep the building. And we want churches to play offense. We want you to use your money to invest in the kingdom and grow your ministry and reach new people. That feels more kingdom to us than just having a capital campaign to fix the parking lot or a capital campaign to fix the roof. We'd rather spend that money on something else that makes a difference for the kingdom. We see this all the time, churches all over the country. I spent the day with the church from Bethesda, Maryland. This is the common cycle: as you get that building, and over a 10-year period of time, for any church building, at some point, you're going to replace the roof, the HVAC, the parking lot. You're going to have structural issues. You're going to have basic paint and carpet and maintenance. That's going to happen. It's inevitable. This constant cycle of capital campaign leads to donor fatigue. And then the people that go to your church get frustrated. And then if there might be a conflict or something in the church that even disrupts it more, a beloved assistant pastor leaves to go somewhere else, or you lose your teen minister or something, and all of a sudden more people from the church are leaving for some various reason. And it becomes even harder to keep that cycle going of capital campaigns. And then you inevitably say, well, we're just going to defer building upkeep and maintenance. We just don't have the money this year. And the roof is bad, but it's not terrible. And the HVAC doesn't work great in this part of the building, but that's okay. We don't really care about that this year. We'll find the funds next year. And so the more you defer problems and don't take care of them, the worse they get. And in churches, this factor is multiplied, particularly if you have water issues. And then most churches will end up at some point doing what I call a Hail Mary renovation. So they'll say, you know what, enough is enough. Let's take the capital that we have on hand. Let's do another capital campaign and let's spruce up and fix up the entire building. And that will renovate our ministry. It rarely has that effect. And it puts you back at the beginning of the cycle where you have to once again do capital campaigns to maintain the renovation that you put together. So you're just in this vicious circle that goes round and around with the building. which is frustrating and exhausting. And all of you know these challenges. So what we want to do is we want to have a pattern disrupt in that thinking. And instead of thinking about this building as a burden and trying to figure out how are we going to raise money to keep maintaining this thing, it just becomes an albatross around our neck. Is we start thinking about what could we do differently with the space that we have that could actually become revenue generating for us, not a burden, but actually a source of income and revenue, because the 401c3 business model is a tough, the 501c3 business model is tough because you don't always know how much money you're going to get. You know, it's some years are better than others. But if you start having recurrent revenue from other sources, that becomes a steadier source of income. So a lot of churches now, and with Narthex's help, we encourage them to think about all the spaces within your building and think about who might use that space or how you might use it to generate revenue for your ministry. And there's a lot of things that you can do that is not super hard. It's not like you don't have to relearn a lot. It's just some creative thinking that and things that we have already put in place, programs and systems that can set these things up. But if we thought about the building as a revenue generating opportunity, and then you just start thinking about, well, okay, the first thing I could do is sell my building if I own it. And then I'd have none of the burden of all the maintenance. That would be somebody else's problem. And I would have cash now that I could invest in ministry and expanding in whatever way. And I feel passionate about with my church, whatever we feel called. You know, every church seems to have its own sweet spot of something they're really, really passionate about. And you'd have money to do that. So there's one idea that's comes right off the top. And then the second is you could lease space to other people that might use your buildings. So I mentioned I have 92 groups looking for space in Kansas City. You know, these are not all groups that are looking for Sunday morning primetime worship space. A lot of them are, you know, small ethnic startup churches from, you know, it's a Samoan Baptist group, or it's a Ethiopian Presbyterian group, or some small group that maybe has 20 or 30 people that just want to use a little worship space in your building or the fellowship hall, and they're grateful to worship on Sunday night or Saturday afternoon. There are daycares all over. COVID decimated the daycare industry, and there are daycares looking for space everywhere. There are Christian schools. There's an explosion in Christian education. And those groups are all looking for classroom space that, you know, that you may not even be using Monday through Friday, that they could use, and they can afford to pay a really nice rent that can augment your income. Daycare is the best kept secret. I tell every single church I talk to that you ought to be in the daycare business. Even if you don't want to run it yourself, get somebody else to rent space from you and operate a daycare in your building, because in both Kansas and Missouri, there's a whole different set of rules for daycares and churches. It's a different operating than it does if you open a secular daycare. They have a whole different set of rules. So there's a bunch of advantages to being in the daycare business. Plus, it's a Monday to Friday operation, which is not your prime time Sunday time. So it really doesn't typically interfere. And there are a lot of daycares out there that are looking for space. There's a group called Lionheart Academy out of Texas. You know, Lionheart has created a model where they'll actually come in and set the whole thing up for you. They'll do all the marketing, the advertising, the licensing. They'll hire all the people. They'll take care of all the employees. All you do is provide them the space, change the light bulbs, and manage the janitorial, and they do everything else. And then they split revenue with you 50-50. It's an ingenious program. But there are those kind of opportunities out there. And when you rent space in your building to somebody else, that is not income. You don't pay income tax on it, nor does it disrupt your property tax exemption. On the Kansas side, your church, you can only rent to a school. It has to be a church or a school or a daycare. There are no other exceptions in Kansas. It's very restrictive. If you rent to anybody else, you might query your property tax exemption. You don't want to do that. On the Missouri side, it's much more flexible. Missouri, you could lease to a daycare or a school or another not-for-profit or another church. You just can't rent to a for-profit operation, but anything else is acceptable on the Missouri side. So you have a lot of flexibility, and that income is not taxable income. Rent income from spaces that is pass-through income to your ministry, you don't pay tax on it. Christian counseling centers. Since COVID, there's an enormous demand for Christian counseling. Those counselors need space, just classroom space, just a small office, just to have meetings. There are a lot of government programs out there, things like Head Start and some healthcare programs. They're looking for space. And a lot of our churches are in these inner city areas where these services are in demand, and the government can be a great partner because they obviously have access to money. The homeschool world and the Christian education world, as I mentioned, looking for classroom space. There's a lot of opportunities for there, and basketball leagues and soccer fields. If you have a gymnasium in your church, you're sitting on a gold mine. There's such a shortage of that for soccer programs, basketball leagues. If you have outdoor field space, Parks and Rec, or there's a bunch of Christian sports leagues around town, and then you have all of those club teams, all those soccer club teams. They're all looking for space, especially in wintertime when it's too cold to be outside. So there's a lot of opportunities there. So, what does it mean to us to play offense? It means that it makes your space come to life. And when people see that, like, Narthex has taken a church and we have filled it up with tenants and there's activity in the building, there's energy. People are like, wow, there's a bunch of cars parked over there. What's going on? That wasn't the way it was 6 months ago. There's people going back and forth. I see kids and families going in and out of that place. And it builds on itself. It creates it. It leads to kingdom opportunities. And as I say, the more revenue streams that you have from non-donors, the more stable and predictable your ministry is, because you have stuff you can count on. And then it makes it possible for you to ride out some of those downturns and upturns in giving that can happen on the exigencies of people who leave you for some reason, for some whim, and then, and all of a sudden they were a good source of giving for your ministry, and then they leave. This helps you even out a lot of those things. 7 pro tips for managing church properties. These are all really simple things and might just save you an enormous amount of money. You can become a property ninja. Piece of cake. Okay. Whenever we have a good rain in Kansas City, go walk the foundation. So 50% of the churches I look at have water damage in the foundation. Why does that happen? Because over time, as we get those hot summer months, the foundation pulls away from the base and it creates a spot for water. So then water drains down into the basement, you get leaks. So this is a simple fix. Walk around after a good rainstorm and see where the water's pooling around the foundation of your church. And sure enough, where there's a way, water will seep in. And then all you got to do is regrade it. Redirect that water away from your foundation. It's going to save you $100,000 10 years later. Simple. Okay, pay attention to your parking lot. It doesn't seem like, parking lots are really expensive when you let them deteriorate to a point where you have to, grate them and redo them. That's expensive, but just sealing them and taking care of them, when you get a little sinkhole there, fix it. That will preserve your parking lot. And it's important because it's one of the first things people see when they come visit your church is whether or not you take care of your parking lot. They see weeds and cracks everywhere. They think, oh, this is not a church that takes this very seriously. So mind the parking lot. It pays big dividends. Give multiple bids. I run into a lot of churches that believe because they're church, they are always getting the most favorable pricing from vendors. It couldn't be farther from the truth. I have seen so many churches completely ripped off. Like, I've seen $300,000 projects that were bid for $1.5 million. Like, it's ridiculous. So, take the time and really get multiple bids on things, and you're going to find that there's a bunch of quality people out there that will give you good pricing and do good work for you, but there's also a bunch that want to cheat you. So watch out for it. Renovate to your strength and don't get hijacked along the way. So what do I mean by that? So a lot of churches want to do a renovation to try to become something that they're not. So for example, a church will come to me and say, Rob, we've decided we're going to have the best teen program in the world. So we're going to build out this, we're going to spend $1 million building out this great teen area. But it's not their ministry. It's not ever been their ministry. They've never had a passion for that. They've never, you're not going to become something you aren't. But play to your strengths. If music is your passion, then renovate toward that. If you do have a great kids program, renovate towards that. But you can't renovate away from your strength and all of a sudden become something that you aren't. And don't get hijacked along the way. Oh, so by what? What I mean by that is you're going to have a bunch of constituents and congregants in the cause of that renovation that are going to say, I want to do that. And I want to do that. And I'm only going to give my money if we do that. And I want to see this bigger and I want to see this expanded. And all of a sudden, you may have a simple renovation program that balloons into something huge because somebody's hijacked your project and you started out with something simple. So make sure you're focused in your renovation and stick to it. Don't let yourself get distracted because that's when costs overrun and conflict arises. Get the roof inspected every year. It's free. It's free. You can call somebody like Christian Brothers Roofing and they'll come out and look at it for free. Church roofs are really a problem because we have steeples and we have lots of different chimneys and little things, and those things leak over time. So get the roof inspected every year. It'll save you a lot. Your plumber is not an electrician. Uh, there's a lot of churches out there, they make a mistake of saying, well, I got a plumber in my congregation. He probably does electrical. Or, if I've got a roofer, he's probably a general contractor. Uh, so just remember that guy's not necessarily. So I go in to look at a church and I open up their electrical panel and I just see wires running everywhere. And that's because they hired the plumber to fix their electrical. They probably got a good price on it, but they also might burn the building down in the process. So be careful. Be careful that you have the right member of your congregation with the right expertise for the right project. And then the last thing, this is my foot stomp, paint and carpet, friends, paint and carpet. If you paint and carpet in your sanctuary in your narthex, your entryway, it'll cost you $20 a square foot and it will freshen it up and liven it up. It will make your congregation happy. It will make people feel welcome. You walk into so many churches and they've still got the 1970s carpet down there, and it just makes it feel like it's not a place that's, thriving and growing. And, every 5 to 7 years, just do paint and carpet just in your sanctuary and in your entryway, and it will have a remarkable transformative effect on everything. And I highly recommend it. So there you go.